I swear, I heard the bull snort, and then a man scream like a kettle about to blow. That's what the mailman told the sheriff, and the sheriff didn't even ask who it was. He just sighed, took one last bite of his sandwich, and said, "Sounds like Earl caught himself another HOA patrol." The real story started a few hours earlier, when I came back to the ranch for the summer. Grandpa Earl had just finished patching up the back fence, the rooster was late as usual, and our dog Moose had treed another HOA drone with a chunk of duct tape hanging from it. That should have been the warning sign. But in this town, HOA drama doesn't knock. It sneaks through your field in a golf cart and thinks it owns the place. Grandpa Earl's ranch was an old slice of heaven carved out decades before the HOA had even formed. His land wasn't under their control, never had been, and legally never would be. But that didn't stop them from trying. Over the past few months, they had been sending out warning letters, fake citations, and even someone who claimed to be a livestock regulation inspector. Earl had a phrase for folks like that. Paper bullies, he called them. All bark, no jurisdiction. But this time, they sent someone new. Someone a little more desperate, and a lot more stupid. His name was Rick. He drove a retired maintenance golf cart painted white, had flashing orange lights glued to the top, and wore a khaki shirt with Community Patrol embroidered like he was part of some tactical task force. He called himself an HOA compliance officer. We called him Rick the Dick. Rick had an obsession with the barn on the edge of the property. Claimed it was an unapproved structure with suspicious modifications. The only modification it had was a better lock after Rick tried to peek in last week. That morning, I was helping Grandpa unload hay bales when I noticed the familiar hum of Rick's little cart coming up the dirt trail. He didn't even park at the gate. He drove right up to the fence, got out with a clipboard in one hand and a camera in the other, and walked right through the field like he owned it. I called out, told him to stop, but he waved a laminated ID badge at me and said, "I'm responding to a citizen complaint about illegal livestock containment. I have reason to believe your barn is being used to house unregistered animals." Grandpa wasn't far behind. He'd heard the same voice and knew the same tone. When he saw Rick climbing the fence instead of using the gate, he didn't shout. He just muttered, "Well, guess it's time." Rick made it to the barn before we did. I tried to warn him, I really did. "Don't go in there," I said. "There's a bull in there, and he doesn't like company." Rick scoffed and said, "You think this is my first livestock violation?" As if he was about to crack open some drug ring instead of a dusty old barn. The door creaked open. Rick stepped inside. I saw him disappear into the shadows, the camera flash lighting up a dusty beam or two. Then Grandpa reached over, slid the metal lock across the door, and clicked it shut. We stood there in silence. Grandpa didn't even grin. He just nodded to himself like he was crossing off a chore. From inside we heard shuffling. Then a loud metallic clang. Then silence. Then a single word. "Hey!" Rick had made contact with Samson. Now, Samson's not your average bull. He's a Brahma, big enough to tilt a trailer if he leans hard enough. He was a gift from a friend of Grandpa's who used to work border ranches. Samson wasn't mean, just very territorial. And Rick, well, Rick smelled like cheap cologne and whatever bad decisions HOA people carry around. Samson took offense. We heard a loud snort, something thump, and then Rick shout, "This is assault! Let me out!" I looked at Grandpa. He looked at the sky. "Storm's coming," he said. The sky was clear. But in Grandpa's world, some storms weren't made of clouds. We could hear Rick scrambling inside the barn, knocking over buckets and climbing haystacks like it was an escape room gone wrong. I wasn't sure if we should intervene, but Grandpa held up a hand and said, "Man stepped in without permission. Now he'll step out with respect. Or limp." It didn't take long for Rick to try his phone. We heard him yelling into it. "Yes, I need immediate backup. I'm being detained, illegally, on a hostile ranch. There's a wild bull and no signage about dangerous animals. I repeat, there's a hostile bovine." That last bit made Grandpa chuckle. Bovine got more manners than him," he said. I asked if we should open the barn before Rick broke something. Grandpa just said, "He better pray it ain't the bull." About 30 minutes later, the cavalry arrived. Not the sheriff, he'd have laughed this off. It was the HOA itself. 3 minivans and a sedan with magnetic signs reading, "Community Oversight Committee," pulled up like they were rolling in to serve warrants. They marched up to the fence and demanded Rick be released immediately. Grandpa folded his arms, showed them the deed that clearly stated our land was outside the HOA's reach, and said, "I didn't invite him in. Didn't lock him in either. Just closed the door after he invited himself." They threatened legal action. They pulled out phones, took photos, and started quoting bylaws. Grandpa didn't flinch. "Your bylaws are good for your neighborhood. This here's a ranch. Different laws, different rules, different kind of bull." One of them tried to climb the fence. Grandpa pulled out his phone and started recording. "Try that again," he said, "and I'll make you famous." Inside the barn, Rick was still alive but clearly not having a good time. He yelled again. Something crashed. Samson let out a deep, irritated bellow. Luke, that's me, turned to Grandpa and asked if we should intervene. Grandpa just said, "Nah. Let him marinate a little longer." That's when we saw headlights in the distance. A single county sheriff cruiser. The door opened, and out stepped Deputy Marks. He took one look at the HOA cars, the locked barn, and Grandpa leaning on a fence post and said, "Let me guess. He didn't knock." Grandpa nodded. "Didn't knock. Walked in like he paid taxes here." Deputy Marks sighed, shook his head, and walked toward the barn. "You got the keys?" Grandpa handed him a spare. As the deputy walked up, he turned to the HOA crew and said, "Y'all are gonna want to stick around. This just turned real interesting." Rick may have walked into the barn thinking he'd find a violation. What he found was a bull, a locked door, and a lesson that wouldn't fit on any clipboard. And it was only just beginning. The deputy stood at the barn door for a moment, listening. Inside, Rick was breathing heavily, shouting out something about being under siege and animal cruelty. The bull, Samson, let out another deep rumble that echoed off the wood like thunder in a canyon. Deputy Marks raised one eyebrow, turned to Grandpa, and asked flatly, "Is he injured?" Grandpa shook his head. "Not yet. But his pride might be in traction." The deputy smirked, then opened the lock with the spare key Grandpa had handed him. He cracked the door just enough to peek inside. "Rick, you all right in there?" he called out. From inside came a frantic voice. "There's a beast in here, and it's foaming at the mouth." Samson, chewing his cud lazily in the far corner, blinked in the shadows and let out a low, unbothered huff. The deputy stepped in, keeping his back against the wall like he was entering a hostage scene. Rick was perched atop the hayloft ladder, gripping the wooden rails like a sailor clinging to a sinking ship. His shirt was streaked with sweat and dust, and his clipboard was nowhere to be seen. "Do not approach," he warned, pointing at the bull with a trembling finger. "That thing is unlicensed and possibly rabid." The deputy, unimpressed, looked over at Samson. "He looks more bored than rabid." Then he turned to Rick and said, "Come on down before you give yourself a heart attack. He's not gonna chase you unless you smell like a threat." Rick started climbing down, hesitantly, one rung at a time. Halfway down, his foot slipped and he yelped, catching himself in the most undignified way possible. Grandpa, watching from outside, chuckled. "That ladder's older than his job," he said. Once Rick was out and dusted off, he immediately started making calls. "We're escalating this. This is interference with a compliance investigation. This is a violation of some kind of livestock act, I'm sure of it." He stormed back to his golf cart, but before he could drive off, Deputy Marks stopped him. "Hang on. You trespassed. That barn isn't under your authority. You weren't invited, you crossed a locked gate, and you made contact with a large animal. That's not a compliance check. That's a criminal misstep." Rick's face changed color fast, first red with rage, then pale with realization. He looked at the HOA board members, who were now starting to squirm. The oldest board member, a sharp woman in her 70s named Linda, stepped forward. "We believed the property was in violation. We were acting in good faith." The deputy turned toward her, unimpressed. "Good faith doesn't mean breaking and entering." She folded her arms. "We'll see what the county says." "I am the county," the deputy replied dryly, then motioned for everyone to hold tight. "Judge Mayfield's already on her way." That shut them up. While we waited, Rick tried to clean himself up with napkins from the HOA snack bag. Someone had brought lemon bars. One of the younger board members nervously offered one to Grandpa, who took it without saying a word and chewed slowly, never breaking eye contact with Rick. The tension was thick, but there was an undercurrent of ridiculousness that none of us could ignore. Even the sheriff, standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt, muttered under his breath, "All this over a barn and a bull." When the judge arrived, it was in a dusty Ford that looked like it had been hauling evidence since the 80s. Judge Carla Mayfield stepped out in jeans, boots, and a scowl. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She looked around the yard, took in the HOA signs, the rattled patrol cart, Rick's dirt-streaked shirt, and the growing number of neighbors who had come to see what the ruckus was about. "Someone want to tell me why my Sunday was interrupted by HOA patrol cosplay?" she asked, deadpan. Rick rushed forward like a man with a rehearsed speech. "Your Honor, I was conducting a lawful inspection of a suspicious structure and was unlawfully detained inside by livestock while investigating a potential code violation." Judge Mayfield turned to Grandpa. "Is that true, Earl?" Grandpa tipped his hat back and shrugged. "He let himself in. I just closed the door." She glanced at the deputy. "We got trespass confirmed?" "Video and eyewitnesses," the deputy replied, nodding toward me. I stepped forward and held out my phone. "I've got footage of Rick climbing the fence and entering without permission. Audio too. He said he was gonna catch us in a violation if it's the last thing he does." Rick tried to swat at the screen like it might erase the evidence. "That was taken out of context." Judge Mayfield took the phone, watched the clip silently, and handed it back with a sigh. "It's not out of context when you narrate your own criminal intent." The HOA crew looked like a row of students caught cheating on a pop quiz. Judge Mayfield straightened up, then announced, "As of now, Mr. Rick is to be considered under county review for trespassing and impersonating an enforcement officer beyond his scope. Any citations issued from this group to this property are null until further notice." Rick stammered. "This sets a dangerous precedent. If we let people ignore HOA boundaries, you're not law enforcement," she snapped. "And this land is not under your authority. Maybe next time, read the boundary map before storming a barn like you're playing cowboy." As the judge walked away, the HOA team began quietly packing up their gear. Rick stood awkwardly by his cart, unsure whether to drive off or wait to be dismissed. Grandpa leaned over and said to him, "If you knocked, you'd have gotten coffee and a warning. But no, had to be the hero in khaki." Rick mumbled something and turned to leave, but just then, the old rooster, Charlie, crowed loud and sudden from the fence post behind him. Rick jumped, stumbled, and nearly fell back into a cactus patch. Grandpa and I exchanged looks, both holding in laughter like kids in church. That night, we sat on the porch, watching the stars come out while Samson lay calm in the pasture like none of it had ever happened. Grandpa sipped his sweet tea and said, "That bull's got more patience than I do. Maybe next time I'll let him teach Rick some manners." I asked if he thought they'd try again. He nodded slowly. "They always do. But now they know what's waiting behind that barn door." I didn't say anything. Just leaned back in the old porch chair, listening to the soft whistle of wind through the grass, and the distant sound of someone somewhere learning what happens when you mess with the wrong ranch. The next morning didn't start with coffee or the usual clatter of hooves on gravel. It started with a phone buzzing on the kitchen table. Grandpa let it ring 3 times before picking it up, muttering something about early morning idiots. On the other end, it was Deputy Marks, his voice lower than usual. "Earl," he said, "you might want to check your inbox. Rick filed a formal complaint." Says you assaulted him with an animal and detained him against his will. Grandpa blinked, stared at the wall for a second, then put the phone on speaker and said flatly, Marks, the only thing that assaulted him was his own ego. The deputy let out a half laugh but added, He's attached pictures of bruises and some shaky phone video that cuts out everything before the bull stares him down. He left out the part where he trespassed, of course. Grandpa thanked him, hung up, and turned to me. Well, he said, looks like the little weasel's trying to turn fiction into law. I pulled out my phone, already scrolling through our camera feeds and files. Should we post the full footage? I asked. Grandpa paused, then smiled. Not yet. Let him spin his yarn. We'll hang him with the truth later. Still, the mood had shifted. Rick wasn't just embarrassed anymore, he was angry. And angry people in HOA polos can be dangerous when they have something to prove. Around noon, an envelope showed up at the gate, hand-delivered by one of the younger HOA board members who couldn't even make eye contact. It was a formal HOA demand for property access, scheduled for compliance reinspection, 2 days from now. This time, it came with a printed letter from their lawyer claiming they had reasonable suspicion of ongoing ordinance violations, specifically regarding unregistered livestock and modified structures not filed in accordance with subdivision charter protocol. Grandpa held the letter like it was a dead squirrel. Subdivision charter protocol, he repeated, then looked out at the open land, the hills rolling far beyond where any subdivision ever ended. They're out of their minds. We both knew what this was. It wasn't about code. It wasn't about livestock. It was about saving face. Rick had gotten humiliated in front of his board, the judge, and the entire town, and now he wanted to claw something back. Maybe get a fine on paper. Maybe catch something on camera that looked illegal, even if it wasn't. But he wasn't going to walk into that barn again. No, this time he'd bring backup. And cameras. And witnesses. That was the game now. So we got ready. I spent the next day setting up every camera we had, 3 motion-activated trail cams around the barn, a wide-angle security feed from the roofline, and even a new drone I just fixed up with a mic attachment. Grandpa had something else planned too. He drove into town and came back with a few heavy-duty signs that read in giant red letters, Private Property, No Trespassing, Area Under Audio-Video Surveillance, Violators will be prosecuted. We planted them like flags around the barn, one every 20 feet. Might as well make it legal soup, Grandpa said. Let them choke on all the signs they want. The day of the reinspection came with sunshine, and just enough breeze to make the grass ripple like a warning. At exactly 10 o'clock, a caravan of 4 HOA vehicles rolled up to the edge of the property. Leading the parade was Rick, this time in a freshly pressed uniform shirt, clipboard in hand, and a body camera strapped awkwardly to his chest like he was starring in his own cop drama. Behind him were 3 other board members, a man with a legal pad, and, just as we expected, a camera crew from the local news. Rick had turned this into a show. Which meant he was about to get an encore. He marched up to the gate, announced himself like someone had asked, and declared, We're here to conduct a lawful inspection of the barn facilities per community charter. Grandpa leaned against the gate, chewing a blade of grass, and said, You're standing on a cattle path, not a cul-de-sac. Ain't no charter out here. Rick ignored him and turned to the cameraman. Please note that the landowner is refusing access to a legal inspection. We'll record this refusal for the board's meeting minutes. The cameraman nodded and kept rolling. That's when Grandpa pulled out his phone and started recording right back. Now, Grandpa said calmly, let me show you the boundary markers. See this pole? That's the original line from 71. Judge Mayfield confirmed it last week. See that paper in your hand? It has no teeth here. And if you cross that line again, that's a trespass warning. The second one's an arrest. Rick opened his mouth, probably to argue jurisdiction or throw some HOA lingo around, but he stopped when I walked up and handed him a USB drive. That's the full footage, I said. Start to finish. Everything you did last time. Audio included. Rick hesitated. One of the board members took it from him and plugged it into their laptop. They watched in silence as the screen lit up with Rick hopping the fence, storming into the barn, and the moment he froze as Samson stood in the shadows. They didn't speak. Just watched the next 10 minutes with pale faces as Rick's voice cracked and the camera caught every panic step he made inside the barn. The cameraman, not affiliated with either side, blinked a few times and then slowly lowered his gear. "Y'all sure this is what you want to air?" he asked quietly. Rick turned to him. "We need this story told. They've been hiding violations. Dangerous animals. Non-compliant structures. That footage is irrelevant to today's inspection." But the board members didn't look convinced anymore. One of them, Linda, the sharp old woman from before, stepped forward and said, "Let's just take photos of the exterior. That's enough." Rick tried to protest, but the others were already backing toward their vehicles. Before they left, Grandpa pointed at the freshly painted barn and said, "You ever try to cross that line again, you won't get a bull. You'll get every rancher from here to the county line lined up behind me. We built this place long before you printed that charter, and we'll still be here long after your paper burns out." Rick didn't respond. He climbed into his cart and slammed the door harder than necessary, peeling off in a flurry of dust and bruised ego. Back inside, we watched the feeds as the convoy left, half of them too rattled to look back. Grandpa poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and said, "It's never about the barn. It's about control. They thought we'd roll over. Instead, they got a bull, a camera, and a lesson." I asked him if he thought they'd finally give up. He didn't answer right away. He just sipped his coffee, stared out the window, and said, "Maybe. Or maybe they'll come back with lawyers. If they do, we'll give them a courtroom they'll never forget." And that's when I realized something. This wasn't the end. It was just the part where the HOA started to bleed. 2 days after the second inspection showdown, the HOA board held an emergency meeting behind closed doors. The agenda was unclear, but word had it that Rick's behavior was being reviewed and public image had become a concern. It didn't take a genius to guess that the leaked footage, now viral thanks to some quiet uploading from a neighbor who, accidentally, received a copy, had something to do with it. Within 24 hours, the video of Rick stuck in the barn with Samson had racked up nearly 100,000 views. The clip cut perfectly from Rick declaring, "I know my authority," to the bull snorting and Rick shrieking like a startled goat. The comments were ruthless. One user wrote, "That bull deserves a promotion." Another said, "Bro brought a clipboard to a bullfight." Grandpa didn't comment on it, but I caught him grinning more than once when the video was mentioned. Then came the knock on the door. This time, it wasn't Rick or the HOA. It was a tall man in a charcoal gray suit with an embossed folder under his arm. He introduced himself as Harold Trask, Regional Counsel for the Subdivision's Legal Advisory Committee. He wasn't there to threaten us, at least, not directly. He wanted to discuss a peaceful resolution to an escalating misunderstanding. Grandpa offered him a seat on the porch and poured him some tea. The man didn't drink it. He glanced around like he was waiting for cameras to pop out of the flower pots. Harold opened the folder and pulled out a packet with highlighted sections. He launched into legal talk about community rights, land encroachment, mutual respect, and something called retroactive jurisdiction expansion. Grandpa let him talk for nearly 5 minutes without saying a word. Then he leaned forward and said, "Son, you're speaking too fast and too soft to be from around here. That tells me 2 things, you're nervous, and you're not sure your own argument holds up." Harold tried to recover, but Grandpa waved a hand. "Don't worry. I'm not mad. I just want to be clear. Is this about Rick filing a lawsuit?" The lawyer paused, then nodded. "He's claiming emotional trauma, career damage, and public defamation stemming from your deliberate endangerment of his safety." I laughed out loud and had to turn away to keep from choking on it. Grandpa didn't flinch. He reached behind his chair, pulled out a small black case, and handed it over. "Inside there's the original footage, timestamped documents, full deed history, and a list of witnesses ready to testify under oath. You can take it back to your firm and tell Rick that if he wants to bring this to court, we'll see him there with a smile and a slideshow. The lawyer opened the case, saw the neatly organized evidence, and closed it again slowly. He said nothing for a long moment, then stood and brushed the dust off his suit. I'll advise my client to reconsider litigation, he said. I would hope this matter doesn't reach the press again. Grandpa gave him a nod. We don't aim to humiliate. But we won't be bullied either. Harold walked off with the dignity of a man who knew he'd lost a chess match before he even found the board. We thought that might be the end of it. The HOA didn't send any more letters. The patrols stopped driving past the gate. Rick's cart was spotted in the next subdivision over, parked in front of a different barn that probably had fewer bulls and more tolerance. But peace doesn't always stay quiet, especially not around here. A week later, while we were setting up fencing repairs along the creek, a local reporter named Jenny showed up. She'd been tracking down stories about overreaching HOAs for a piece called Subdivision Tyrants, and somehow our little standoff had made her radar. Jenny wasn't interested in drama for its own sake. She wanted facts, footage, and follow-up. Grandpa invited her in, sat her down with a plate of cornbread, and gave her the full play-by-play. I showed her the edited and unedited videos, the property deed, and even the survey maps dating back to the 70s. Jenny took it all in with wide eyes and a growing grin. This is gold, she whispered. It's absurd, it's funny, it's real, and it hits people where it matters, home. She promised to keep it respectful and left that evening with everything she needed. The story aired the next Friday. Titled, The Barn, the Bull, and the HOA That Went Too Far. It ran for nearly 15 minutes and featured every moment Rick probably wished he could erase from time itself. The internet exploded. Memes, remixes, parodies, the whole package. Grandpa became a local legend. Folks in town started calling him the Bull Whisperer. One man even showed up with a hand-painted sign that read, Rick for Rodeo Clown of the Year. But the best part came a few days later. The HOA board held another vote, this one public, and Rick was formally removed from his position. Not fired exactly, just relieved of compliance authority indefinitely. Linda, who had kept a sharp eye on him since the barn incident, took over and immediately announced that the HOA would be revisiting its enforcement policies. In her speech, she said, We need to remember we're neighbors, not a militia. The crowd applauded. Life on the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. The fences were mended, the rooster remembered his job, and Samson strutted through the pasture like he owned the county. But we didn't forget. We upgraded the cameras. We posted copies of the boundary survey at every entrance. And we made sure the community knew that just because someone wore khaki and carried a clipboard didn't mean they had power out here. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast gold across the fields, I asked Grandpa if he thought it would ever go back to how it was before the citations, the drones, the bull in the barn fiasco. He leaned back in his chair, tapped the side of his mug, and said, Nope. But maybe that's all right. Sometimes peace doesn't mean quiet. Sometimes it means standing your ground so loud that nobody dares cross it again. I looked out at the barn, the same old building that had become the center of a storm, and nodded. He was right. The next week, we added one final touch. A new wooden sign above the barn door, hand-carved and hung with care. It read, Private property. Trespassers will be fed to the bull. Below it, in smaller letters, it said, Just kidding. Unless you're Rick. And for the first time in a long time, we had the kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from a line clearly drawn and permanently respected.